In Module 1, Lesson 7, we talked about and explored rounding decimals. When talking about rounding, we're going to be working with this definition where you're changing a number to a given place value. And a lot of people think that it's to a whole number, but when you're working with decimals, you might not be rounding to that whole number. You might be rounding to a tenth of a whole. You might be rounding to a hundredth of a whole. So you have to be very careful and precise in the language that you're using to describe rounding. So let's start with this problem, rounding 14 to the nearest tens. And so we want to really look at this whole number, and there's a couple different strategies that we can use. The first strategy that we've used and talked about was the number line. And you would draw your number line. We drawed it up and down, but you can also draw it side to side. And when you draw your number line, you have a starting point down on the bottom, and you also have an end point at the top. And then we talked about this point in the middle that's called a midpoint. And a midpoint is a number that is in the exact middle of two other numbers. So let's take a look here on our number line. We're rounding 14 to the nearest tens, and so we want to ask ourselves, 14, what's the 10 below 14? And that would be 10. And so we're going to put that on our bottom. And then we want to ask ourselves, what's the 10 above 14? And that would be a 20. And so we would put that number up top. And now our midpoint would be the exact number in between these 2 points, which is 15. Then our next step in our number line is we want to put in our number on our number line, which would be 14. And we know 14 is just a little bit below 15. And then we ask ourselves, we know numbers that are 15 or 5 and above, we round up. Numbers that are below the 5, we round down. And our number 14 intersects this going down number, so we know that we're rounding down to 10. So we can put that number right here. So 14 rounded to the nearest tens is 10. So let's look at this number like we did in class and round 187 to the nearest hundred. In this case, because we're rounding to the hundred, we're going to be looking at a different number, and we're going to be looking at what numbers are in the hundred spot. So let's draw our number line. And we have our bottom point down here and our top point above, and then we're also going to need our midpoint. And looking over here, we're going to ask ourselves, what would be the nearest hundred underneath 187, and that closest 100 would be 100. And then we would ask ourselves, what would be one more in the hundreds, and that would be 200s. Okay. Then we talk about our midpoint. What is halfway between 100 and 200? And that is 150. Then we place our number on our number line, and we're looking at that next one over the tens, and we're comparing it to this 5, and we're asking ourselves, is that 8 above or below that 5? And since 8 is more than 5, our 187 would go above the 150 on our number line. And we know that anything that is 150 or up gets rounded up to 200. So if we rounded 187 to the nearest 100, we would get 200. Now I want to draw special attention here to where we got our midpoint conjecture or our midpoint noticing. In both of these midpoints, we noticed that they had a 5. And what's also interesting is that 5 is following the place value that we're rounding to. In this one, we're rounding to the hundreds place value, which is a 1, which is always followed by a 5. Here, we're rounding to the place value of tens, and that tens place value is followed by a 5. And so we could make this statement about our midpoints. Midpoints have a 5 in the place value to the right of what you're rounding to. So if we're rounding to 100s here, the place value to the right is tens, and it has a 5. The place value we're rounding to here is tens. The place value to the right is ones, and so it has a 5. And we're going to use this idea as we start talking about rounding decimals. So let's take a look at homework question 1, and it's giving us the number of 4.3. And it's asking us to round it to 3 different place values. The first one, it's asking us to round to hundredths. The next is asking us to round to tenths. And the last one is asking us to round to the ones place value. And over here on the chart, they're asking you to do a decomposition or to decompose a number. To decompose a number, it means you're breaking down that number into how many of each unit or each place value you have. Another way we might say that is to rename the number, and it's also known as the unit form of a number. So if we took our number 4.3 and we put it into our place value chart, when we're decomposing a number, our unit form here we start with is 4 ones and 5 tenths. Now let's say I wanted to rename it to the most tenths that I have. To do that, I would bring this 4 over here, and it would be, because I can unbundle those 4 into 10 units or 10 discs in my tenths, and that would become 45 tenths. So instead of doing all the little dots for breaking down, I can just say I would have 45 tenth discs on my chart. Now I don't have any hundredths and I don't have any thousandths, but if I wanted to break them down, I could go even further and say, all right, how many hundredths do I have? By moving that number over again and saying 45 here and bringing down that 0 and saying, oh, I have 450 hundredths discs here. And then taking it even further into that thousandths, I can just bring that whole number over here, 450, and then I bring that 0 down, and it's all because of bundling and unbundling. Now, the reason that they ask us to decompose is because they want us to look at and see which one of these decompositions would be the most useful in helping us round. And I'm actually going to start over here with the ones column because I feel most comfortable with that, and I want to start somewhere that I'm comfortable with. So I'm asking myself, which one of these decompositions would be the best one to use if I'm rounding to my ones? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look in my ones column, and I see a 4 right there. So I have 4 ones and 5 tenths. Then I would bring what I have here. I'm saying, okay, if I'm rounding to the ones, I know that my top point and my bottom point are going to be the ones that are below and above the 4. This 5 I'm just not going to worry about until I get to placing my number on my number line. So if I'm looking at 4, the number that is below 4.5 on the number line is 4. It's that same number in 4.5. And then I ask myself, what's the ones that's right above that 4 on the number line? And it's a 5. Now I'm asking myself, according to my midpoint conjecture here, my midpoint is going to have a 5 in the place value to the right of what I'm rounding to. And since I'm rounding to the ones, my tenths column is to the right, so I'm going to have a 5 in my tenths column. So I'm just going to put that 5 here. And now I ask myself, what's going to go in that ones column? What would be between 4 and 5? And it would be that 4. So I have 4, 4.5 and 5 on my number line. And now I can go in and add in my 4.3. Oh, I just noticed that I decomposed 4.5 instead of 4.3, so I'm going to go back and change that really quick. So 43. Okay, so we have our number 4.3, and we're really looking at the midpoint. The midpoint is the one that is going to really help us to decide where our number goes. And so we're looking at that 3 in comparison to the 5, and we're asking ourselves, is that above or below the 5? And since 3 is less than 5, we're going to place our number down here, 4.5. Oh, I'm sorry, 4.3. Okay, and then we know any number that is below this midpoint is going to be rounded down to 4. So if we're rounding 4.3 to the nearest ones, we are rounding down to 4. Now let's take a look at tenths. Which decomposition am I going to use for tenths? And so I'm looking in this tenths line, and I am seeing, oh, okay, I have 43 tenths. So I'm going to come over here to my number line, and I'm going to have 43 tenths. Now 43 tenths can also be written as 4.3, because I like to think about if I have 43 tenths, how many place values past the past the decimals, the tenths, and there's one place value, and then you fill in your number like we were practicing with writing standard form. So then I asked myself, okay, what's the tenths that's below 4.3? And we always just add 1 to there, so we have 4.4. Now we get to our midpoint, and we know that our midpoint is going to have a 5 in the column to the right, and the column to the right is hundredths, and so I'm going to place my hundredths here. I know there's 2 place values, and there's going to be a 5 in that column right there. And I'm looking down here, and I see a 3, and I just fill this number in from the bottom, so 4.35. So my midpoint between 4.3 and 4.4 is 4.35. Now, to add my number 4.3, I don't have a hundredths place to compare to that 5, and so I'm going to add in a 0, because I can add in zeros after my number. So I'm looking at that 0 and that 5, and I'm noticing, is that below or above? And 0 is less than 5, and so my number down here just happens to be on that line 4.3. And so if I'm rounding to the nearest tenth and 4.3, it would be 4.3. All right, hundredths. We are going to ask ourselves, which of these decompositions would be the best to use? And I am going to be here in the hundredths column. Let's use a different color. And my number in the hundredths column is 430 hundredths. So I would come over here to my place value chart. And I'm asking myself, okay, I have 430 hundredths. And so I know after my decimal, there's 2 place values for hundredths. And then I'm just going to fill in. So the 0 comes first. And then I have my 3. And then I have my 4. And then hundredths, 1 above this would be 4.31. And asking ourselves, what's the column to the right? And it's thousandths. So I know that in my number line, my next column over, thousandths is going to have a 5. So I can add my 0 to get the thousands. Oh, that number is exactly like this one, so we're rounding